here. We're just welcoming everybody into CBI, the Capacity Building Institute. We get together here once a month. I'm so happy to be your host. I'm seeing as the participants join in, if you've joined us before, you know, one of my favorite parts to kick off, of course, is everyone telling us where they're coming from. I'm Sam Laprade, and I'm in beautiful Ottawa, of course, the land of the Anishinaabe people. We appreciate you all being here today. I love hearing where you're coming from. We've had people join us from New Zealand. We've had people from BC, PEI, and everywhere in between. So look forward to hearing where you're coming from today. Our topic today is so important, so timely. I cannot wait for all of you to hear from Dwaine Taylor. We wanted to spend the first couple of minutes today with a very good friend of mine, and that is Hannah Rockburn. Where are you, Hannah?
Hi, Sam.
There she is. She's hiding her angel wings. She really is the angel behind everything we do here at CBI. Hannah's going to tell us a little bit about the Capacity Building Institute, and then I'll be right back.
Great. Thank you, Sam. I'm just going to share my screen. Great. So as you know, my name is Hannah, and I am the operations manager here at the Capacity Building Institute. And I just want to talk a little bit about our organization for those that may not be as familiar with us. So CBI is a nonprofit organization, and we're dedicated to providing training, coaching, and mentorship support to staff and volunteers in the environmental nonprofit sector all across Canada. We are one of 3 nonprofits that work with sustainable capacity solutions to provide this capacity building training for these organizations. So we aim to provide equal opportunity and access to capacity building training for every small shop, nonprofit, environmental leader across Canada. We offer a range of subsidized training programs for any stage of your journey. If you are an executive director, to a youth intern, a board member, or another staff that might be or volunteer but is involved with your organization. And we aim to equip you guys with the skills, resources, and connections you need to be these effective leaders and make a lasting impact. All of our training is focused on 6 core themes. So we have financial management and fund development, governance and board development, volunteer engagement and human resources, communications and outreach, risk management, legal issues, as well as leadership and organizational culture. And we deliver these different themes through a variety of different programs as mentioned. So our big one that we're obviously doing tonight is our capacity building webinar series. We come once a month, free webinar for an hour, where we speak with various different experts in the field on these different topics that we can then have a discussion and sort of learn from each other with these topics. Then we also have our capacity building certificate program. So this one is aimed for program leaders, executive directors, coordinators of organizations, and we are also have an intern version of that. So our intern program, training program, is meant for just youth entering the field that want to understand the differences and backgrounds and basics of nonprofit organizations and the sector. Both of those, we do have registration open for anyone that's interested in those programs. So we do highly recommend to check out our website at capacitybuilding.ca to register or show your interest in these programs. If we don't have enough interest, we won't be able to run the programs this year. So please touch base with me if those are something that would be interested to you. And then we also are running our pilot program for boards. So this is engaging senior leaders, where we have 6 amazing individuals that have lots of experience within the field, and we have matched them with nonprofit organizations, and we've been giving them board training and having them be active in their community. So we're hoping that through this successful program that we'll be able to expand this program in the future as well. We have amazing trainers and lead coaches for our organization and for these programs, Sam Laprade being one of them. We also have Rob, Barb, and Alex, amongst many others. And I just want to do a quick shout out to our funders and our supporters. Without these groups and many others, we would not be able to complete the amazing work that we do. So I just wanted to take the moment to thank everyone that's involved in our programming and providing resources and their expertise to our courses. If you would like to contact us, there's multiple different ways. You can reach me through email at info@capacitybuilding.ca. You can visit our website. You can give me a call with the number there, or you can visit us in person if you're in the Ottawa area. So there's lots of different ways to get a hold of us, and we would love to chat either about our programs or how we could help your organization build capacity. And I would also like to let you know, save the date. So next month in April, we have our theme of meaningful youth engagement. So we have a couple great guest speakers coming in to talk about that topic on April 24th at our regular 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern time. And with that, I will pass it back to Sam to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Hannah. Thank you. And today's topic is so important. Those hiring practices and really through the lens of EDI. I'd like to introduce the one and the only Dwaine Taylor. Where are you, Dwaine?
I'm here, Sam.
There you are. I'm so glad. Dwaine, of course, from NewPact and the executive director there. First of all, let me hear a little bit about NewPact. What are you doing over there?
Thanks for welcoming into the space, Sam and Hannah, for that great summary of everything the Capacity Building Institute is doing. NewPact is doing a lot of what the Capacity Building Institute does. We really focus on supporting nonprofits, charities, and what we call community-centered businesses. So these are the small and medium-sized businesses rooted in their communities to advance their practices around social impact. And that includes equity, diversity, and inclusion, all the way through to how they actually measure and communicate the impact they're having in their communities. So we're a collective of social impact consultants, and we spend a lot of time working with these organizations to advance their mission, their vision, their goals, and really connect them with their communities and the impact they're having day to day.
Wow, that's really inspiring. And I think now more than ever, to have these opportunities to connect. It's all about connection. I think we all realize that through the pandemic for sure, that we all, need that connection and support. So that's wonderful. Today, our topic is those hiring practices around EDI. For those aren't familiar with the term EDI, help us out, Dwaine.
EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Now, you've probably heard various versions of this. You might have heard DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, EDIA, which includes accessibility, JEDI, which includes justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. They're all fundamentally talking about the same concepts. And we're going to have a chance to dig into that today.
Mm-hmm. And, when you think about hiring, I've been, hiring for positions for probably close to 30 years now. And you certainly, it's really become very interesting to receive resumes. I remember, putting out for jobs, a post out for jobs, and I get 90 resumes back in the day. And now I'm lucky if I'm getting 20 sometimes, right? I mean, it's the market has shifted, particularly after the pandemic. I promise that's the last time I'll mention the pandemic. But it really is, the world is shifting, and with Canada being so open to people from other countries and having them come and be new Canadians, it really does offer a lot of opportunity for all of us to enrich our workplaces with new Canadians and Canadians alike in our workplaces. But there are some unconscious biases, Dwaine, that I'm really concerned about. Talk to me a little bit about how these are being addressed.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And thanks for that framing there, Sam. I think what's really important for us to understand is that the world is increasingly more connected. And what you just highlighted is a great example of that. We are now seeing some of the most prolific migration of folks around the world. There was a time when a person from a specific country or ethnicity would spend their entire lives in that one country, in their one community. And we're actually seeing migration happen for climate reasons. We're seeing migration happen for economic reasons. And as a result of that, our communities are more and more diverse. Even the communities that are the small communities that we sometimes would think would never change in 100 years are starting to see really big, bold tapestries of cultures and identities and religious practices start to come together into one. And in that space, there's a lot of folks who, for the first time in their lives, are interacting with someone different than them. And that might seem like a foreign concept or something that's quite strange if you grew up in a major metropolitan area. You know, I grew up in Brampton, Ontario, just outside of Toronto. Toronto is actually statistically, I think at this point, one of the, if not the most diverse city in the world. So for me, growing up and interacting with folks that are different than me was normal. For a lot of folks that grew up in maybe some rural places around the Ottawa area or even in rural Canada, this will be some of the first touch points they're having with folks who look different than them, practice a different religion or faith than them, have different cultural practices. And those are things that are rooted in their experiences. And that's really how bias is formed. And those biases can exist in our personal and our professional lives. They don't kind of stop when we go to work, and they don't only exist when we're interacting with our families. And those biases leak into the way we make decisions as leaders of organizations, as staff in organizations, how we interact with our coworkers. So one of the core facets of equity, diversity, inclusion work is recognizing and understanding that bias exists, and that's okay. It's not this big scary thing like it was in science class in grade 7 where you say, we want to get rid of all the bias, right? Bias is a fundamental reality of how human beings think. And there's a lot of neuroscience behind that. And really what equity, diversity, inclusion work does is it roots us in that understanding and then asks us to reevaluate why that bias is there, and then implement solutions that will strip away some of that bias, just like a science project. Right? We know it exists. The objective is making sure that it doesn't impact people in really detrimental ways. And we'll get to talk a little bit about how that works, I guess, in the workplace today.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think when we think about hiring practices, and when you were speaking, I want to make sure I mention this today, because I think often we think about hiring practices as we put out a job posting, we receive the resumes, we do those interviews, and we hire someone, and it stops. And what I've realized, and I'll tell you, I was not born a manager by any stretch. I'm managing people has been a struggle for me for many, many years for lots of different reasons. But what I've realized is that onboarding process is also part of the hiring process, setting somebody up for success. So it's one thing to bring somebody into your organization. It's another thing to ensure and set them up for success. How are we doing in terms of EDI on the onboarding?
That's a really great question. I think it differs organization to organization, but you're quite right in that we can get really caught up in process. The hiring process is often quite rigid, not very accessible, not adaptive to cultural, religious practice, accessibility practices, neurodivergency. All of these things tend to be removed from the hiring process. So what tends to happen when we're hiring is we end up with folks who fit the process that we've established. So if our process is rigid, the types of applicants we get becomes rigid. You're tightening the pool of applicants that you will get because your process itself isn't very open. So let's say you do get, a few diverse applicants, whether that's neurodivergent, divergent applicants, folks from different cultural or ethnic backgrounds that you've typically engaged. Those folks are the exception. They're actually the outliers because they're fitting into a system that wasn't designed for them. They make it through the interview process, they join your organization, and you go, awesome, we now have a diverse organization because we've hired someone who looks different than everyone else. But the problem is that up to this point, they've actually already faced so many barriers to their success just to get into the organization because of the process that they just went through that wasn't considerate of their unique needs and perspectives. Then they get to the organization. If that's how the hiring process is, it's so much harder to navigate that day to day, right? If the process for getting selected is challenging for those folks, what's the process of working if we haven't considered how we actually adjust and adapt our processes for being inclusive when we're selecting folks? When they actually start, we can almost guarantee that that's not going to be the case either. So what we're actually seeing is a lot of organizations are spending a lot of time focused on diversity, streamlining their hiring processes, getting people in the door that are diverse, that are different, have different viewpoints, perspectives, skills, backgrounds, disabilities, and so forth. But then those folks get to the organization and we're seeing rapid turnover. Those folks are now leaving organizations in a matter of months, weeks in some cases, because the environments that they're entering aren't actually constructive for their well-being. And that's where we end up with this duality of the chicken before the egg. The reality is it's the chicken and the egg. You have to do both to be successful in this space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, such a good point. And when we think about, you know, that whether you're getting 20 resumes or 60 or whatever it is, that process of reviewing resumes, and we've seen studies, and I remember a study, I would say it's a decade ago, but don't quote me on that, Dwaine, but it feels like about a decade ago, where somebody took a number of HR executives and they put resumes in front of them, which included the person's name, and the schools that they attended, you know, asked these HR individuals to make a choice on a short list. And then they took those exact same resumes, they removed names, removed any identifiers that would mean that the person didn't study in the country that they were in. And the list that came back was two different lists for the most part. And they were being chosen on name, ethnicity, location of school, etc. What lesson is there for all of us?
Yeah, that's what you're referencing, Sam, is actually one of the first iterations of what we call hiring bias. And that study is actually, I think, more than 10 years, almost 20 years now, in 2024. Yeah, that one's been around for a while. But the lesson there is it just goes to show you how powerful subconscious thought is, and how powerful subconscious bias can be. There's a really great book by, I think it's Daniel Kahneman. I might be saying his last name wrong, but he wrote a book called Think Fast, Think Slow. Really, really powerful book that really explains human psychology at a granular level. And in that book, he talks about system 1 and system 2. System 2 is our rational brain. It's the brain that is analytical, that helps us do things like math problems and work through challenging work scenarios. And everyone likes to think that they're system 2 and that system 2 is always in control. That if we saw that resume, we would be able to strip away all the biases that we've been a part of, that we've grown up around, that are core to our being, and that we'd be able to look at just the skills and the experiences of someone and say, I will make an objectively sound decision that is not riddled with bias. But the reality is our system 1, those are automatic functions. Those are the things that, you know, make us stretch and yawn certain ways, that make us, you know, get that weird feeling that someone's watching us, even though we don't know that someone's actually behind us. Those sort of gut inclinations, those gut inclinations actually control the majority of how we navigate the world. And a lot of neuroscientists and psychologists know this, and they've known this for a very long time. And when you apply that lesson to hiring, specifically when you apply it to hiring and equity, diversity, inclusion, that's how something as simple as having 2 identical resumes, but one with a name that you're familiar with and one with a name that you're not familiar with, can have you choose the name you're familiar with, even if their resumes are identical, even if you don't know their names, even if you are just looking at, hey, but you know, I'm familiar with that town or that school. Your brain is automatically starting to put together those connection points of, this is familiar to me, so it feels more comfortable to me, and this is unfamiliar to me, so it feels less comfortable. And that's how bias is implemented. And if we don't build our processes and practices in a way that allows us to strip that out, that's how it gets reinforced. And then we end up with this consistent cycle of, you know, I did a really good job reviewing those resumes. I was really thoughtful. I was very system 2. I was very analytical about it, without realizing that a lot of those decision-making drivers were actually just familiarity triggers, gut instincts, things that you can't really explain or even sometimes aren't even consciously aware of.
I'm going to take you back probably about 3 years ago. Aside from the wonderful work I get to do in fundraising, I help organizations find that next superstar. So fundraiser and executive director, it could be a data manager, whatever. I've placed 36 people since March of 2020. And about 3 years ago, I was working with an organization that I have a lot of respect for. And, you know, a lot of different clients want to do things differently. This particular client wanted to review the resumes. They wanted me to review the resumes, and then we would come back together and pick our top 4. So I did that and he did that, and then we met. And so we did this kind of try and make it a little bit fun. I said, okay, here's my one. And then we saw if we matched, and then he said, okay, here's my number one, and saw if they matched. And at the end of it, we only matched two. So we had two the same and two differently. And my number one was somebody that hadn't got on his radar at all. And I was really curious because this person, like, on paper was perfect. And I said, oh, I'm really surprised. Like, how come this person, so-and-so, didn't come on to your top level? And he said, and this is really hard for me to talk about him. He said to me, I don't know how to pronounce their last name. And so they'll probably have an accent that our stakeholders will not be able to understand. And I really struggled that day. And I will say that I wish I was braver that day. We did interview her. She did get the job. But in that moment, it's bothered me still 3 years later that I wasn't brave enough to say what I would say now. And what I would say now is, I want to check you on that, what you've just said. But at the time, because I was a little bit flabbergasted, but also truthfully probably not brave enough, is I didn't say what I really wanted to say, which was, can we just check ourselves here? And I'm not judging you, but can we just check on what you've just said? We might be losing a fantastic person for something that we need to give this person an opportunity. I think, unfortunately, this is happening a lot. So I'm kind of opening myself up here, Dwaine, because I really think, it's happening it's happening everywhere.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, first off, thanks for sharing that, Sam, and thanks for being, I think, open and honest enough to talk about the feelings that you were navigating in that space. It's not easy to admit that. It's not easy to admit that you had an opportunity to check someone, to recenter the conversation around really what the objective is, to really dig into what they meant by that comment, and provide a learning opportunity for them and address the elephant in the room, which was discrimination. Really tough thing to do for a lot of folks. And you're absolutely right that this is something that happens a lot. It happens every day in conversations, in boardrooms, in classrooms, in hiring committees all around the world. And the challenging thing about that is you're right. A lot of us don't have the capacity or the knowledge or the comfort to have conversations in that moment. Sometimes you're just caught off guard, because sometimes it could be, how could someone even say something like that? Right? You're going through that process of, that's a very shocking statement. And then it's, how do I even respond to that? Right? Like, what is the response? And sometimes you're not able to go through that process in that exact moment, right? In a very quick and effective way. I've been in this sort of scenario, and I've been doing this space for a long time, this work for a long time. And there's two lessons that I think I pull from that type of experience, both your experience and the experience that others I know have had and have spoken to me about as well. The first is that, the fact that you caught it is good. That's the first thing. Like, it means that you have an awareness, right? That's really critical. There's a lot of folks who don't have an awareness. The person in this case who made that comment probably isn't even aware that what they're saying is xenophobic, potentially racist, right? There's lots of layers to that they don't even understand yet. They haven't even hit that awareness piece. So I think the first thing is, center yourself in the grace that, okay, you're aware of these pieces. And then I think the next step is figuring out what held you back from action. Is it fear? Is it discomfort? Is it lack of knowledge? It's different for everybody. For some people, it's, fear of reprisal. They don't want to say anything because they're worried about how that would change their relationship with a friend, a family member, a colleague, a client. For some people, it's that they know they want to say something, they just don't have the words. They don't know how to say it. For other people, it's they know they want to say something, and they feel motivated to say it, but they just can't put the right sentence together and do it in a really constructive way. Because the other thing is you don't want to damage relationships that exist. Whatever the pathway is, that's the piece that individual, yourself, or whoever is going through the scenario needs to work on. I think for a lot of people, comfort is the big one. Is the being comfortable talking about these topics, being comfortable saying words like racism, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, like understanding what those terms are, understanding what they mean, saying the word neurodivergent. Like these are terms that folks seem to want to erase from our vocabulary, but that erases the identity of all those people that are a part of those communities, right? So being comfortable talking about that is really important. And then once you're comfortable, then figuring out what your gaps are. Do you need to learn more about that particular topic? Do you need to understand what xenophobia really is and the impacts of that? And that equips you with the knowledge to be able to then lean into that conversation in a really constructive way. The other piece is sometimes it's not about what you say, but how you say it. And a lot of times a really powerful approach to confronting discrimination in a setting like that, not when someone is experiencing harm in front of you or harm is being created. In those environments, it's really important to step in right away and ensure the safety of the person who's being impacted. But in a scenario like what you've shared, two people having a conversation in private and someone makes a comment that is discriminatory, sometimes you don't actually need to check them. Sometimes you need to question them. And it can be really powerful just to take a moment and say, what do you mean by that? And force them into that process of system two thinking, because they're reacting on their gut inclination, their system one, their internal biases. And that's where that comment comes from. It's not a comment that you really will think about, like that you would discriminate someone based on their last name. You wouldn't think about that consciously and say that unless you or really have some, foundationally xenophobic or racist beliefs. So understanding that, you would know that that person's coming to that from a gut inclination, internal bias lens. And just by asking them in that moment, what do you mean by that? When you say that someone can't pronounce that person's last name, are you saying that you can't pronounce that person's last name? That forces them to pull themselves out of that unconscious bias and think critically and then explain themselves. And if they can't explain themselves, they might come to that conclusion without you even saying anything yourself. They might realize their own bias. And that's a really powerful opportunity of learning for them.
I am so glad I shared that with you. And thanks for being so gracious with me as well. I think it's just one of those moments that's bothered me for a long time. And although in a public forum, it's a little bit awkward, but I think the learning for everybody and even for me today, if it was to happen again, you've given me some tools and some ways to think of that differently. So thank you for that. Let me ask you, let's just even go back to a job posting. How can we make sure in our postings that we are setting somebody up to even apply for that job from an EDI lens? I mean, I've seen some wonderful posts about work environments and people talking about it, but how can we all learn today that even the job posting is step one?
Yeah, that is such a great question. I'm really happy you asked that one, Sam, because there's so much tangible things. But my big lesson is don't make promises you can't keep. Is the first really big thing. When you think about people who've experienced oppression or discrimination in their lives, the universal theme, whether it's race, ethnicity, gender, sexual identity, is a mistrust and a broken trust of relationships with organizations, institutions, or people. If as an organization, you say that we are this incredibly inclusive organization and we do all this really great work and we really value diversity, and someone applies and everyone in your hiring committee isn't diverse, the organization isn't diverse, there's no inclusion policy, there's none of those pieces, you've made a promise you can't keep. And that's where we end up in those scenarios of lack of retention, lack of engagement, and that creates bigger problems down the line because the word spreads and people start to talk about this organization isn't an organization for racialized people, for queer people, and so forth. Then there's the tangible things, really tangible things that a lot of people don't think about. So one of the easy things that I can share is how you post your job. So if you post your job, a lot of times folks write out job descriptions in a Word document, export it to like a PDF, and post a link to the PDF on their websites. PDFs on a website, unless they're downloaded, are not accessible to many screen reading technologies. So if you have someone who's visually impaired, they might not even be able to read that job posting. So that's a really simple action, right? Is simply don't put your job posting in a PDF. Make sure that it is built into the text box functions of a website. That's a really simple one. Another really common one is the length and structure of the job posting. Job postings sometimes are ridiculously long, 3, 4, 5 pages of paragraphs and bullet points and paragraphs and every single detail of what that job entails. For some people, that would be great. For some people, it's quite overwhelming. There's a lot of studies that show, actually, and this is a really powerful one when it comes to gender diversities. When you look at folks who identify as men and folks who identify as women, women are less likely to apply for a job unless they meet every single checkbox on that job listing. It's about 70% less likely compared to men, who actually will apply for a job if they meet at least 50% of the checkboxes on that job listing. And I have personal experience with that. I've looked at a job and been like, I can do about half that job. I'm gonna apply. And I've had my friends, I've had my partner, I've had folks say, I'm missing this one qualification, so I'm not gonna apply to this job. So understanding that is like a rooted bias that's socially constructed. That's something you can address up front. You can actually say in your job posting, you do not need to meet every single requirement we list, right? Mm-hmm. You can meet a few of them if you feel like this is a job that is that you can provide value to an organization that aligns with your values and your interests. Please apply. That's one example. Where you post your jobs, really, really big. A lot of folks post their jobs on traditional job board sites, things like LinkedIn or
Indeed.
I think it's Indeed. Yes, that's what I was looking for, Indeed. Yeah. So you think about these job posting platforms. Who is accessing those job posting platforms? Folks with stable internet connections, folks who know how to navigate the job system. So these are folks who are familiar with job posting platforms in a Canadian context. So you're probably not going to get a lot of folks who live in rural areas who maybe don't have stable internet connection. You're probably not going to get a lot of folks who are new Canadians who are still navigating job structures and systems. But even in Ottawa, the city that you and I live right now, Sam, there are incredible organizations who specifically, for example, work with newcomer Canadians and are literally have internal job boards and career coaches for folks who are new to Canada. What would it take for an organization just to email, World Skills Employment Center and say, hey, I have a job, please consider sharing this in your job posting. And knowing that that person in that environment has the support of that organization and that organization's skills to help them find the job that best suits them, draft an application that shows the breadth of their experience and their knowledge, and then actually apply. So where we post our jobs, it's not as simple as like click and throw it on LinkedIn. That's like throwing it into the ether of the internet, right? And then we say, well, we didn't get any applicants from rural areas. We didn't get any Indigenous applicants. We didn't get any newcomer Canadians. It's because you just threw it on LinkedIn, right? Like that is one avenue of where folks will actually access that content and that information. So really critical that we really interrogate, where we're posting it, how we post jobs, what we say in those job postings. Is that job posting itself accessible? And then in addition to that, we also have to be willing to kind of challenge our own processes. I saw a really great story of a young man named Tanner recently. It was publicly shared, so I'm comfortable sharing his name, and he's neurodivergent. And an organization had a very rigid job process, as many of us do. Post the job, submit your resume and a cover letter. We review it. Once we submit your resume and cover letter, then we invite you for an interview. Then you go through this like questionnaire. There's all of these sort of rigid steps that we're used to. And this hiring manager knew that Tanner was neurodivergent and knew that that was a process that would be overbearing for Tanner, wouldn't necessarily be effective. So the hiring manager worked with the manager of the organization, the director of the organization, and said, can I bring this candidate in for a sampling day? We bring them in for a sampling day, get them acclimatized to the environment, have them understand what the work environment is. And of course, with Tanner's approval, and said, is that something you're interested in? Compensated him for that day. That's a really big piece, compensating people for the time they take to apply and interview. And said, we really want to understand more about you and what makes you work effectively. If we bring you into this environment and we test it out for a day, we'll be able to assess you more effectively. Turns out he did incredible. He was incredibly good at attention to detail, really, really focused on just the ability to take, quantify and map out information in really meaningful ways. But that's not something that he would have been able to show in a traditional interview because his ways of communicating weren't atypical, right?
Right.
And they ended up hiring him. He's been successful ever since. And I think those are some challenges that we need to navigate. Is sometimes our processes are going to be flawed, no matter how inclusive we try to make them. We actually might still be exclusive. And when we come to that barrier, there's an opportunity for us to say, what is the purpose of this process? If the purpose of the process is opening it up to broader people, broader experiences, maybe we need to change our process. And not just say, well, we've done the work to make this as inclusive as possible. So if they don't fit in this box, even though the box is bigger, we're still not going to consider them. So those are some tangible examples organizations can take.
I love that example so much because it could be happening so much more, to be honest. So that's phenomenal. I want to ask you before we go to the participants' questions, what keeps you up at night when it comes to hiring practices through the lens of EDI? What keeps you up thinking about the ways that we can do things differently, and what's some of the fear around this for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Actually, a good friend of mine asked me that recently too. They asked me, in all my work doing workshops and trainings with organizations, what is the thing that's most unsettling for me? So a very similar sort of question.
Mm-hmm.
I think the most unsettling thing for me is when leaders of organizations, particularly, these are usually the folks that I'm engaging, when they perceive the work of justice, and I say justice broadly because that includes equity, diversity, inclusion, human rights, all these pieces. When they perceive that work as transactional, there's a lot we can do to build equity, diversity, inclusion, anti-racism, and so forth into our organizations. There's great frameworks, there's books, thousands of practitioners, there's coaches and organizations like mine that can come in and provide that advice. But if you're doing it just to do it, just to say, yeah, we checked the box. We hired someone to come talk to us about this. We went through our hiring practice. All good, check, check, check. We're never going to do this again. Or, yeah, we'll do it in 10 or 15 years, right? Then you're kind of missing the point. The what is important, right? How we do things matters. But the only thing more important than how we do things is why, right? Why are we doing this? Mm-hmm. Do we have a fundamental core belief that this is what's right to do? Mm-hmm. Do we have a fundamental core vision for a more inclusive world, a more inclusive organization? Do we understand that this is the way to be a more authentic, more embracing, more heartfelt human being at its core, to truly live the values of inclusion? If you don't have that at the core of your decision making, if you haven't navigated that in your own personal life, in your own personal work, anything you do at an organizational level, hiring, trainings, policies, whatever it might be, it will just become transactional. It'll just become like a pilot project for a new initiative that you're launching at an organization. If it doesn't work in 3 years, you'll get rid of it. And we're seeing that right now in really tangible ways. I often say that what we see in the corporate and philanthropic spaces and education spaces in the United States is about 3 years away from happening in Canada. There's a really good study that shows the trends of economic and social revolt and how these things kind of tip between Canada and the United States. After the murder of George Floyd in 2020, thousands of organizations in the United States, emptied their pockets towards equity, diversity, and inclusion. They were like, yes, we believe in this. We understand the importance of this. We're going to do it. That was 2020. It's 2024. And over 80% of those organizations have clawed back or completely eradicated their equity, diversity, inclusion initiatives. We're seeing actually in the post-secondary space, specifically a space that I used to work in, almost 80% of the equity, diversity, and inclusion senior leader roles in post-secondary institutions have been eradicated, particularly in states like Florida and Texas. We're seeing even big companies that seem to talk about their diversity and their progressiveness, like Google and Apple and all these companies that we hear of all the time. Even they're clawing back their initiatives, right? Disney, the storytelling conglomerate corporation of the world that tells these beautiful, rich tapestry of stories of culture. They're having internal struggles now of folks saying, we're making movies that are too diverse, right? Our movies are too diverse. What does that even mean? You're in the business of storytelling, but these are the decisions that are happening. And I think all of this is happening because at the core of that decision wasn't a want and a values alignment to do this work because it matters. It was, well, we have to do it. And it's kind of important. It's gonna affect our bottom line. And as soon as it didn't affect the bottom line, then they're changing course. So I think that's the biggest thing that keeps me up at night is, why are people doing this work? And that's one of the first questions I ask whenever I take on any sort of agreements or relationships with an organization.
Yeah. We've got a couple of questions. I want to get to them, of course, really quickly, but just in terms of that, I just want to say that when you were speaking, it reminds me of a couple of years ago, I was interviewing somebody on my radio show regarding Pride Week.
Mm-hmm.
And we were talking about, it was celebratory and it was a great conversation. And then he sort of stopped me in my tracks because he said, please, I'm begging people, do not put a flag on your business or on your front lawn if you don't want it there 365 days of the year. You want, walk the walk, talk the talk, but please don't do it because it's Pride Month, Pride Week.
Mm-hmm.
That was such a big moment for me, like, not to make it about me, but I thought, how often am I doing that? How often are we doing that? Where, we sort of, gaze somewhere for a week, 7 days, 30 days, whatever it is. But then, you could say the same thing for Black History Month. You can say the same thing, regarding so many things. But I thought that was a really brave thing, once again, for him to say. But I also thought it was a really good lesson that your example of Floyd. I mean, that was such a really important example of how George Floyd, really galvanized so many people around the world and continues to. But when it doesn't fit someone's narrative, how quickly they drop the funding, or they drop the focus.
And yeah, absolutely right, Sam. And I think I love the example you gave of, if you're not going to show up every day, then like don't show up today, because that's the definition of what they call as performative. I think the big piece and lesson there that I want to leave folks with in that context is, if you have the ability to look at something and engage with something and then walk away when it doesn't fit your narrative, or fit what you want out of it, or it's too much work, or it's too uncomfortable, that in itself is a privilege that you have. And if you choose to exercise that, that in itself is a reflection of the fact that you're not really committed to this work just yet, right? George Floyd is a great example. George Floyd galvanized people around the world, but for the years and years and years before that, other Black men and Black women were being brutalized by police, and I was posting about it on my social media and my Facebook and stuff, right? And no one said anything then. People paid attention to George Floyd because we were all locked in a house during the pandemic and had to, right? And now people don't have to.
Yeah, and the 9 minutes and the police, and I mean, it became just this rallying call, calling for his mom. I think there was so much in that, But to your point, you know, the hundreds and thousands of people that came before probably called out for their mom too, you know.
Exactly. And I think the difference is folks had the ability to tune out from that. They had the ability to say, oh, well, you know, it's in America. It's you know, it's not that important. I think the convergence of what happened with George Floyd and the pandemic, just we were in a heightened state of like information consumption where we couldn't avoid the information. That's all we were doing because everyone was scared of this virus and what was happening around the world. So it just opened everyone's eyes. And I think the difference now is the folks who have the ability to check out are checking out now. They can kind of walk away. Oh, it's not for me. It's not something I want to engage with. But folks who live it, folks like myself, we still have to deal with it every single day. And I think that is the difference between allyship, like true allyship, and performativeness. Is true allies will show up all the time. And that doesn't mean you're at every protest and you're aware of every social justice issue that's happening in the world. It just means that when you do see something that impacts others in really detrimental ways, discrimination, violence, war, human rights, homophobia, xenophobia, that you take that second to engage and you say, you know what, I am going to engage in this moment. I'm not going to lock myself away from it, shut it down, choose not to engage, because that choice not to engage allows that to continue to fester and grow. And that's what keeps me up at night. And I think that my hope is that organizations in Canada, particularly those in the social sector that are doing really transformative work, that's not something that they're navigating. I'd hope that. And I haven't seen too many examples in the social sector. A lot of these examples tend to be in government and private sector. But we're not immune to it, just like we're not immune to bias. So for all the leaders on this call, something I would think about is, if you're learning anything from this, learn that it's important for you to do the work for yourself before you bring that work to your organizations, because otherwise it won't be effective, it won't come across as authentic, and you're more likely to retreat from it when things become difficult, because things will become difficult. You will be challenged on why you're doing things, you know, why you're suddenly focused on inclusion and why it's important for your organization, and being able to genuinely and authentically talk about that is a big part of the process.
100%. Dwaine, we've got 2 questions from participants today. I'll start with the very first one. I'm going to read what's been sent in. So it's from an anonymous attendee today. Let's say a predominantly white organization starts prioritizing diversity in their hires. What practices can they apply to build a safe and equitable environment once candidates are hired? We touched on this a little bit, but I'd love your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a great question. My first answer would be, don't prioritize diversity in your hires until you understand what that means for your organization and how to create that environment. So a lot of times, again, organizations start with like, oh, we're just going to hire for diverse candidates, but then those folks join the organization and it's not inclusive, and then you've actually just created harm for them, because now you've put them through this process of going through the hiring process, getting selected, they start the job, and then, you know, on their first 2 or 3 days, they could experience racism. So you've just like walked them into an environment where now they're experiencing harm. So I think that's a really big piece. Another big piece is understanding what you mean by diversity. Oftentimes when we talk about diversity, we talk about what we see skin color. So that's one of the first things people think about is, we see skin color, so we're talking diversity based on race. But there's a lot of diversity that exists outside of that, visible and invisible. So being really clear about what you mean when you say we're prioritizing diversity, like what kind of diversity, what is your organization currently missing? Is it race, or is there something else that you're missing as well? And how do you apply all those intersections? In terms of building an internal culture, I think it's really critical to have tough conversations with your teams and set the tone as an organization. And this work needs to happen well before hiring new and diverse candidates as an intentional effort. You might naturally have diverse candidates apply, but if you're saying I'm intentionally going to hire for diversity, making sure that you're having conversations with your current team, ensuring that, you know, every time someone makes that, you know, offhanded comment in the office, that there's someone there to reel them in, to check them in that moment, and that becomes a part of your team culture. making sure that your policies are constructive to that as well. So a really tangible example is holiday policies. One of the easiest things organizations can change is how much time people get off for holidays. All of our holidays right now in most of Canadian organizations are structured around Euro-Christian holidays, Christmas,
Right.
Easter, and so forth. We all have a long weekend this coming weekend, right?
Yeah.
But there's a lot of folks who don't practice Christianity. So it can be really easy, instead of saying you must take these days off, structuring your policies around, we all get the same pools of days off, you can take them off whatever holidays work for you. Setting all of that up in advance is really critical, because it will actually help you, one, with recruitment, because then these folks are going to see that in your policy, see that in the job posting, and go, oh, they've thought about this before I even apply. And then once they actually join the organization, you start to create a culture of belonging for them structurally, but also intentionally in the interactions they're having with their coworkers. So my recommendation is always start with the internal before you go external. It can be really easy to say we're going to hire a bunch of diverse folks, but the harm that creates can be quite challenging. So instead, focus on how can we create an environment where if we hire diverse folks, they will be safe, they will feel a sense of inclusion, belonging, acceptance in this space. And when you feel that that space is safe and constructive, then start to invite folks into that intentionally. Folks might trickle in on their own, and that's okay, and they can be a part of that building. But I wouldn't recommend outwardly recruiting them intentionally until that space is constructive.
Okay, very helpful. Question number 2. In a traditional interview structure, what practices can people doing the hiring apply to evaluate candidates from an EDI perspective? And they go on to say, or are the processes before getting to the interview and the interview questions more critical? What a great question.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that the processes before the interview are more critical. I think they give you different outcomes. So the processes before the interview, so the examples I gave of how you post your job postings, is it accessible to read on screen readers, where you're posting it, that will determine the diversity of candidates that apply, right? If your posting is accessible, you're more likely to have folks with neurodivergency or visual impairment apply to your job. So you'll actually get a bigger, more diverse pool of candidates based on how you post and set up your posting for your jobs. The actual process of the interview, that's more around equity. That's actually more about how is your interview process catering to the various needs of the candidates that have actually applied, right? And you're going to get a different outcome there. So if it's, you might have a diverse group of candidates that apply, but then they get to the interview process and you haven't considered that same level of intentionality in the interview process, then you're going to have candidates who aren't successful in the interviews, even though they might be great candidates. You're going to have candidates who just drop out and say, I don't want to do the interview because it's not accessible, it doesn't meet my needs, etc. So your pool shrinks even further, right? And then you end up with a smaller pool of candidates, and then inclusion is the internal element. That's what happens when they actually get selected and become a part of your organization. So they're all important. You cannot do any of them in isolation. Otherwise, you're just breaking the chain, right? Diverse candidates that get to an interview and aren't successful because the interview is not accessible and doesn't consider EDI doesn't solve the problem. Having that great process but not reaching out to folks in the ways that are important still doesn't solve the problem. Bringing them all the way through the organization and then they're there, but then they have a horrible experience still doesn't solve the problem. You need to have all three. And that's why people say equity, diversity, and inclusion. No one really says one or the other. They are all interconnected. In terms of tangible pieces, I think I talked a lot about the pre-interview stuff already, accessible job postings, being really clear about where you are as an organization. In the interview process, some really tangible pieces. Share the interview questions in advance. That's a really easy thing. We don't need to play at gotcha moments, right, with interviews. I think what's really interesting about interviews is we seem to feel that like it's not having an open book test of an interview is inherently bad. But interviews aren't tests, right? You're asking them to articulate their experiences and their skills related to the job in a way that works for them. Some people are secondary processors. Some people need that moment to like read that question, go through their resume and write out, hey, these are the experiences that I have, and share that. Some people you can say it to them and they're like me and they're quick talkers and they could just, start talking about it right away. There's not going to be a structural advantage just to anybody by sharing the questions in advance. Whether if someone are really good at thinking on their feet, they're going to be able to give you a good answer then or earlier. If someone is not so good at thinking on their feet, then they're going to be able to give you a strong answer if they have the questions in advance. So a really simple thing that you can do is share those questions in advance. ChatGPT isn't going to write an answer for them. So
yeah, exactly. And I think we've all been there where we've had an interview and we're like, oh, if I could go back, I would say, this, and this. So we've all been there.
Yeah.
When I joined you today, before we went on camera, I said to you, Dwaine, this is going to go by so fast. Now, it went by even faster than I thought. I can't believe it. Our time is just about up. But before I let you go, I always love giving people resources. You gave us a book to read, of course. But where else are you sending us for great information?
Yeah, really, really great resources. So this is a shameless plug a little bit. Not as shameless as talking about NewPact. So NewPact is something that I do as a side juncture to my full-time role. I work at Future of Good as the director of programs there. For folks in the social sector, if you don't know what Future of Good is, it's a journalistic and learning organization that tells stories about what's happening in the social impact space. And there's a lot of stories on EDI specifically. So really suggest subscribing to Future of Good, because it'll just give you the stories and the context that's really relevant to the social sector specifically. So you're not just going to get these broad sort of strokes about what's happening in this space, but you'll get some really granular pieces and some really helpful pieces on like funding models and government policies and all those other pieces that are important to the sector. So that's a really amazing resource. This is less of a resource, but something that I encourage folks to do personally. Your phones, whatever your favorite social media app is, whatever it is, TikTok, before it's banned in Canada too, like TikTok, Instagram, all these sorts of pieces, whatever it is that you use, take a moment, go through your social media feeds, and ask yourself 3 questions. Do the people on my feed look like me? Do the people on the feed have similar opinions to me? Or do the people on the feed have similar backgrounds or experiences to me? Odds are that the majority of the people you see will fall into one of those 3 categories. If that is the case, that means you have an echo chamber in your social environment. You're constantly being reinforced the same notions, the same ideas, the same structures. In that case, follow people that are different than you. Find activists in your community, find organizations that do work that are completely out of scope of anything you've ever heard of. You've never touched anti-racism, follow an anti-racism organization. Get exposed to that content, because the more you're exposed to the content, the more comfortable you will get with it. And the last piece, if you are doing this work already internally, and some folks are, and now you're like, I want to apply this to my organization, there's a really great book called DEI Deconstructed by Lily Zhang. Lily Zhang, they're an EDI consultant that works primarily in the United States, but has done some really tangible takeaway pieces for organizations. And it kind of acts as a roadmap to like, how do I apply EDI to the work that I do? Really great book for folks who have already done that personal work and are just looking to dig into that a little further for their organization. And then, of course, last but not least, if your organization wants to do this work with a coach, consultant, facilitator, NewPact is always here. And I'm always happy to help you with that.
Dwaine, I learned so much today, and thanks so much for your grace today, for all the great information. I know our participants got a lot out of it. You've already gotten a great comment here about the excellent content you provided today. So thank you so much for spending time with me, and I appreciate all of the great ways that you really have indicated that we can all move forward and learn. But hopefully set the world up for just being just a bit of a better place.
Just a bit better. Thanks, Sam. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for checking in. Hopefully you found this content helpful, and good luck on your journeys.
Yeah, thank you so much. Dwaine Taylor joining us today, of course, from NewPact. This is the amazing webinar I am so honored to host every single month. I'm Sam Laprade, and the Capacity Building Institute every single month is coming up with great content for you, great opportunities for you to become engaged. And I know the wonderful team over there would love to hear from you as for ideas as well for upcoming webinars, so don't hesitate to reach out. Once again, I'm Sam Laprade. Have a great month, and we will see you all in April. Take care, everyone.